So through the middle part of chapter 3, where we spent time last Sunday, the emphasis of love and love for brethren is what John talks about. And really, as we've seen throughout the epistle of 1 John, love is this reoccurring theme. We've seen this. In chapter 3, boy, he's just dwelling on this a lot. And as we've said, there has to be some reason for this point of emphasis, is what we were thinking. And yet, while surely it was important at that time, we've seen so many purposes and reasons for application there too. And we've talked about that some there, that love is to be found among brethren. And we've recalled the fact that Jesus had some things to say about that. You know, about how others would know, he says, they'll know that you're my disciples, you know, by the love you have for one another. And so that reoccurring theme is something that I want to be reoccurring in our mind, to understand that character, that attitude that brethren would have one for another. In the more latter part of chapter 3, love is something that is demonstrated, as opposed to indifference. Those were opposing points there. You know, the emphasis was here we have the mind, the attitude of Christ versus the heart of men. You know, what a difference that is. And so these were some of the points that were coming out. When we concluded the class last Sunday, the point of emphasis was that of confidence, verses 19 through 21. You know, the idea of confidence that we can have toward God, confidence that we can have that we are of God. And really what we have seen and what we'll continue to see is some markers that are put in place that help us to understand whether we are of God. And of course, this whole emphasis on love was one of them, but there's more. He's leading into something more here very soon in chapter 4. A pure heart was something that we talked about a little bit toward the end. A love of truth is something that does not condemn us, but in fact our heart is set on truth. Again, this being part of a transition taking us into chapter 4. Well, a transition that starts all the way in chapter 1. Remember the points and emphasis there about truth. But here it comes up again, this idea of truth. Truth does not condemn us. Truth is what helps to give us confidence. That if we know and understand God's truth, and if we are walking in that, we know we have a relationship with God. That's where we started back in chapter 1. And that's the point that's continuing even now. Confidence is increased when we live to obey God. Chapter 3, verse 22. And whatever we ask, we receive from Him, because we keep His commandments and do those things that are pleasing in His sight. And this is His commandment, that we should believe on the name of His Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another as He gave us the commandment. Point of emphasis again, isn't it? About love. There's love for God, love for one another. And once again, fellowship with the Lord is the topic that comes up again. Verse 24. And he who keeps His commandments dwells in Him, and He in Him. And by this we know that He abides in us, by the Spirit whom He has given us. So we've seen several points along the way about how and why we should have confidence that we are in Him. We've seen over and again that it has to do with the truth that He has delivered, and that we are willing to walk in it. It tells us something about having an idea, some knowledge of what that truth is. And as we get into chapter 4, this becomes the important point. We can have confidence that we walk with Him because of His truth. If we know His truth and we walk in that, we should have confidence that we are in Him. Now, perhaps a reason for this overemphasis at this point is because of where he's going in chapter 4. Remember we talked early on about some of the other teaching, the Gnostics, you know, the leaders and such that were around, and some of the things that they were teaching. I think that has something to do with where he goes here as we get into chapter 4. About being able to recognize what is truth. Well, of course, that's been the emphasis from the beginning of the epistle, is knowing truth. Now there's some application. I think we've seen some of that already. But we get into chapter 4, there are some real points of application to be made here. And I think that was pertinent to those Christians long ago. But I'm going to tell you, it plays just as well now. It's just as important for us now, we see. But again, could I say just one more time that there is a confidence that we should have, that we are walking with Him, and that we can know that He abides in us as we abide in Him. I'm thinking that there were some whose faith was rattled. Perhaps it was by those Gnostic teachers that were teaching just, well, not to review all that, but just some absurd things. And what John is trying to tell them is that, no, you can know that Christ is in you. You can know that He abides in you. And you can know that you are in Him. This is the confidence that we should have. And so my impression here as we get into chapter 4 is they were being pressed on these things. Because when we get into chapter 4 now, beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. Let's think about this for just a moment here. We're transitioning a little bit in chapter 4. So not only is he teaching that the disciples can have confidence in their own faith, but that they have the ability to sort out those who would want to destroy their faith. That there should be a clear distinction that's being made. And what he's telling the disciples, what he's telling us, is that we can work this out. We can know. Not only can we have confidence that we are in Him and He is in us, but we can have enough confidence to stand up against those who are speaking against Christ. We can do that. And we can sort that out. And here's how you do that, is what he's saying. And here's how you go about it. There's this familiar theme that's going to come up again here in just a moment of God's love. Seems like maybe a peculiar place for that to come up again. Oh, but maybe not. Maybe that's not peculiar at all for that to come up again here in this context. But let's talk here for a moment, and we'll have a little discussion just on what exactly is this supposed to mean here. You know, what verse 1 says. In fact, I'm going to go back and read verses 1 through 6 and try to start putting some things together. But verse 1 is what sets us off on this study and this discussion today. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits, whether they are of God. Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God, but every spirit that does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming, and even now it is already in the world. You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. They are of the world. Therefore, they speak as of the world, and the world hears them. We are of God. He who knows God hears us. He who is not of God does not hear us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Okay, I'm thinking there's a few things we can talk about here. I think we got a few points we can work on. Do not believe every spirit, but test them. Let me ask a couple of questions. What is John cautioning the disciples of in verse 1?
False teaching.
False teaching. And in essence, he's saying, like, don't be fooled by this. You know, don't be fooled. If we think back to what we were just talking about, you know, those who keep God's commands have fellowship with Him. And so there are those, the Antichrist, who is trying to draw away from God. Don't be fooled by them. Give me some more from verse 1. What else can we draw from this?
There's a lot of false teaching out there. Like, he said, for many false prophets have gone out into the world. Like, this is a, I feel like especially now today, more than ever, there is more false teaching out there than ever before.
Mm-hmm. So many different flavors of Christianity we find these days, and beyond Christianity too.
He's already made the point about love, and he's already said don't love the world.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's many false prophets in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So we already have on this one hand love, fellowship, abiding, and then over here we have not love, not abiding, not in fellowship. There's no middle ground. So I think that's one more connection, along with the spirits too. He's connecting these spirits and the message and the word. So there's false prophets delivering their spirits or their messages. So there's a lot. He's just connected everything so beautifully.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this idea of testing. How do we go about testing the spirits? How do we know? I mean, how do we know if we're giving the right test? How do we know if we can discern what is an evil spirit or what is a good spirit?
No.
Right?
I've given you this truth. This is what we've been telling you, or what I've been telling you from the beginning. And we've seen and witnessed and heard, and it's the spirit of truth. And you compare it, basically.
Yeah.
That's what he's saying. Like, well, he's not being egotistical. He said, listen to my message, my little children. You listen to me. And then if it doesn't mesh, because many have gone out from us. So that's how.
Okay, and I want to get into that a little bit more here in just a moment, because in the latter part of what we just read, did we pick up on the you and they and us and we and he? Like, who is this? I mean, who are all of the ones that he's talking about? And what becomes his point of emphasis with that? I don't want to go there quite yet. I just want you to start, be thinking about that. That's part of this context right here. But still, the idea of testing the spirits is kind of like, okay, how do we do that? And as Brad is saying, what John has said so far, we've emphasized this truth thing so much. Because John emphasized this truth thing so much. This is the basis. Isn't it interesting? Now we can step back. We're far enough in this. Now we can step back and we start to see how he has patterned this and why he has said some things earlier, and then he built on it, and then he built on it. And now we're at this point of saying, okay, now let me tell you how this works.
Well, I think the first test is those that confess that Jesus is from God. I mean, there's your litmus test.
We are down to the brass tacks right there. And of course, these are pretty easy to determine. If someone says, well, I don't even believe in God, and you shouldn't either, well, that's pretty easy to work out. I can identify those folks. That's not too hard. And yet, evidently, there were those who were that bold, having some influence, because he brings it up. So that part is easy. But still, how do you test the spirits? I mean, okay.
Did it come from Jesus?
Okay.
From the apostles? Did it come from that one source?
Okay.
And through the one people, the apostles?
Okay.
Is that who taught it?
It's just like in the Old Testament period of time. There were those who were God's spokesmen. Those sometimes who spoke directly for God and who gave his will. And the prophets, of course. And so how do you determine, who is of God and who is not? Well, the speaking of the prophets was proven by signs and miracles. As was even with Jesus, demonstrated he was the Son of... Oh, and the apostles did that too, didn't they? And so in verse 6, there was that point of emphasis. He said, basically he was saying, we, hear us. And back to the point that was made, that the apostles and the inspired writers of God. Listen to us. He had talked about you and them and they. And then he said, we. Listen to us. How do we test the spirits? Well, we're back to this point in this idea of truth, right? Okay. 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for correction, for reproof. Reproof is that idea of testing, proving what is right. So we're just very simply back to what God's Word has to say. And then again, that's pretty easy when someone says, I don't even believe in God and I don't know why you do. It's pretty easy to sort that one out. What's harder, like Ben, what you were talking about, there are so many different theological ideas today, so many religions, so many faiths. What faith are you, people say? It's a little hard to work that out because sometimes there are faiths or religions that kind of sound like us, at least in some points. And so how do you test the spirits? How do you test what people are saying? But it's back to the brass tacks, these points here, the truth that has been given.
I don't know if we can communicate or connect this, but I did have Acts 5 when they were saying if it's from God, you'll know it. If it's from men, it'll fail.
Absolutely.
So all these false spirits, like, well, that one didn't work. Well, let's come up with a new idea. So that could be one of those markers too. Hey, if this is the truth and from God, it's going to stand.
Yes.
And it'll be consistent. Whereas if it's from men, well, it could be faddish. It could wax and wane. Or their
Sure.
messages can even change.
Sure.
So that could be another marker.
Absolutely. And in fact, even as you say that, you can think, even in our lifetime, of religions that's had some kind of, a big splash, but kind of fades away after a while. Somebody has a big following, and it kind of goes away after a while. We've seen that, if we look at religious history, for several hundred years, certainly we see that ebb and flow.
Also, I don't mean to jump ahead, but in verse 6, he says, whoever listens to us, we know that they are from God.
That's right.
So that's a big deal right there. I think basically he's saying that whoever listens to us, we apostles, that we're sent directly from God to do this work. For us, that application is, are we paying close attention to what all the apostles, all their writings?
Absolutely.
That are right here in the Bible.
Absolutely. So some other thoughts started going through my mind as you were saying that. It reminded me of a couple of things. Quick side trip. Look at Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7. That there are so many different ideas that come about. Sometimes people just get caught up into some ideas and philosophies, not knowing any better because they don't have that basis of truth. It's pretty easy to follow some other things. Sometimes there are those who are intent at trying to take us, at trying to destroy our faith. And I think Jesus dealt with that in an interesting way here. We're at Matthew chapter 7, verse 15. Let's talk right here, verse 15. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. We can make that point that John's making the application of that. That you can test the spirits. That you can know whether they are of God. The warning from Jesus was, don't be fooled, because sometimes sheep aren't really sheep. You know, really sometimes they're wolves, but they're just covered up in sheep's clothing. Don't be fooled by that. And really John's saying that too. Test the spirits. Don't just accept. Don't just do what others are saying. You can be drawn away. You can be pulled away by that. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11. In verse 13, it's the Apostle Paul speaking this time. Similar point. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 13. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself transforms himself into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also transform themselves into ministers of righteousness, whose end will be according to their works. Can Satan fool us? Yeah, he can. He's good at it. This is what he does. This is his purpose. Here's what he's trying to do. He's trying to deceive us. His ministers, you know, his followers, they're good. You know, Paul is saying they're real good. You know, don't be fooled by that. And so think about what John is saying later. As the time comes where John's writing this epistle, these other things have already been said and taught. And now John's saying, test the spirits. And all that he has said coming to this point, I mean, we have only repeated as much as John has repeated. We've repeated a lot. But it's because in those first chapters, that's what he was doing. He was repeating the same points, saying it a little bit different ways sometimes, but he was saying the same things over and over again. And now it's the application, test the spirits. And I can imagine someone saying, but how? And John would want to scream, of course it wasn't divided into chapters then, but he would want to scream, read chapters 1, 2, and 3. You know, that's how you test the spirits. That's how you know. And so for us, what I want us to know, what I want us to walk away with is an understanding and confidence. Oh, remember how the last chapter ended on that point? Confidence. I want us to have confidence. Confidence that only comes from understanding the word of truth. That when somebody says something or teaches something or has a philosophy that we go, wait a minute, I'm not sure if that's right. That we have a means of being able to discern what's right and wrong. I want us to have that kind of confidence.
And on a practical level, like you said, if somebody says, oh, hey, Jesus didn't come in the flesh, that's easy. But when we have brothers and sisters, and it wax and wanes, because the Spirit, he gave us the Spirit at the end of chapter 3, and Paul calls it in 2 Corinthians, or 2 Thessalonians, the gospel. And he says, so then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by spoken word or letter. You know, sometimes we get on this, we don't want to be traditional. Well, some traditions are based on the truth. And so when we have a brother or sister who puts out a little book like Radical Restoration, or the one that's circulating now, that's Searching the Pattern, like it's 2024, and I believe we've been doing it wrong this whole time. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, I can see some of their points, but hold up a second. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? So, and that, it's not like he's saying, hey, I want you to convert to Islam. Mm-hmm. This is supposed to be a brother in Christ, like, you know. So that's the real tricky part, and it could be just like some of these brethren, it's like 90% of it sounds really good.
That's right.
So we got to be, so traditions are not necessarily a bad thing when they're based on the truth.
That's right.
And that's what Paul says. So just in our own time, our own era, there's stuff, and then of course they come and go.
And among brethren.
Among brethren,
okay,
yes.
Among brethren. And that's where it gets very difficult. That's where it gets hard.
Yes.
That's where it gets hard to discern. Where sometimes even brethren that we've respected at some time, but now have a new idea, something they've studied about really hard, and they've really discerned something that none of the rest of us have been able to figure out.
Right. And they get a following.
And they get a following. And it's a repeated pattern. It's a repeated thing that happens over and again. And, you know, I wonder if that happened in the first century. Oh yeah, it did. It did. And there were those who were drawn away. And so, this emphasis on truth and being able to discern and test the spirits. You know, there are a lot of people today who would claim to have faith, be people of faith. And then I wouldn't doubt in most cases when people say that they believe in Jesus. You know, they believe in God. I'm not questioning that. But where their faith leads them, what they practice in religion, how they worship, and what they believe about salvation and many things, it doesn't take a very long conversation sometimes to realize that our faith is different. That we have some very different criteria in faith. A lot of people say they have faith. But true faith, saving faith, cannot be separated from truth. Saving faith cannot be separated from truth. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Romans 10:17 was a simple passage. One perhaps repeated too often, I think. And then I think, no, I've not said it enough. Because that basic truth right there draws a distinction between faiths. Many people say they have faith, are religious people, and yet faith that is not based on truth. I don't think everybody that was coming up to the disciples long ago were saying, Jesus never came in the flesh, or there is no God. There were some doing that, we know. John deals with that. Secular history tells us that. That's easy to distinguish. The struggle is those who say, well, I have faith just like you. But my church does this. Or our church, we believe this. And we sometimes want to act as though, well, you know, we're almost the same. You know? And as if there is no distinction there. But there is a distinction that was made by God. And so now when we come back to this point of testing the spirits, it becomes more difficult, doesn't it? Because sometimes it seems like we're saying the same thing, but we're not. Maybe that's a little bit more what Jesus was saying when there are wolves in sheep's clothing. Almost look the same. We almost sound the same, but we're not really the same.
Joe, I think it's also incumbent upon us to understand that there are, well, let me say it this way. You talked about wolves in sheep's clothing. The image that you gather is that there's someone coming to deceive us. Mm-hmm. So there are people that are openly trying to deceive us. Mm-hmm. There's also people that are honestly mistaken.
Yes.
Okay? And we need to understand that the end is the same. If we're going to fall for something that somebody's telling us and they are trying to deceive us, knowing that they are trying to deceive us, mm-hmm. and someone coming to us in a sense of that they actually believe this,
yes.
that they're actually sincere about this.
Yes.
Well, you can be sincerely wrong.
Yes.
And everything has got to be measured against the Word of God. And so a lot of people will allow themselves to get to fall into something, to fall into some kind of false teaching, because they believe that the person that they're talking to is just so sincere. They're just so sincere. How can they be wrong?
Mm-hmm. And they may be sincere.
Yeah.
Okay, so, okay, good. How do we try to make a distinction? How can we draw a distinction between the, you've described two very different scenarios. Someone who is trying to cause trouble, someone who is that wolf in sheep's clothing. And here is someone who believes they understand truth and they're practicing it. You know, when our interaction with the two, well, what should it be like? How do we respond?
That's the whole reason that the word, that he gave us the word. Everything is measured against the word. Everything. You know, so you're going to say this, you're going to say that. Okay, well, let me check that against the word and see if that complies. And if it doesn't, if it sounds fuzzy, then that's when the red flags need to go up. So everything gets measured against the word.
I think that's exactly correct. Verses 4 through 6. I want to look at the way John says what you're saying, okay? Because we were saying before, like, you know, you, them, they, he, us. You have all of these different descriptive words here. You know, of whom is he speaking, and what is his point? Is what we want to draw from this verse 4. You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. Wow, right in that one verse, you know, you little children, this is how he's addressed them throughout the letter. He's talking to the saints, to the Christians, and he's saying to them, this is a point of encouragement. You've overcome. You've done this. You've demonstrated this. You've overcome them, those who are opposed to Christ. We used those another word he used, anti-Christ. Those who are opposed to Christ. Because he who is in you is greater than he who is of the world. Point of confidence. The power of God is greater than the power of the world. Yeah, I know there's more of them than us, but that's okay, because we have the power of him who is in you. Verse 5, they are of the world. Therefore they speak of the world. Of course they do. How else would they speak? They say the things of the world. They talk like the world. They hold the philosophies of the world. And the world listens to them. Verse 6, we, and this part's a little tricky first. We are of God. Now who's the we? You have to look at the rest of this first, because you look at that real quick and we think we, well, those who are in Christ. No. Who's the we in verse 6? It's been said already. We are of God, and he who knows God hears us. He who is not of God does not hear us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. Okay, there may be a couple of ways we look at this. But I'm taking a little point of emphasis on this, thinking back to chapter 1, the first few verses. What were some things that John said about himself?
I was there. Listen to me. I saw, I touched, I heard.
Yeah.
And I'm proclaiming this message to you.
Yeah. That's the way I view this verse when he says we. That's my thoughts on that. That, you know, he's reverting back to what he said at the beginning. You can have confidence in this, what I'm telling you, because I was with Jesus. I was there. I was with him. I saw everything he did. I witnessed these things. You know, we are of God, and he who hears us, he who knows God hears us. You know, Dina, going back to your point a few moments ago about that very thing. You know, how do we know what's right? How can we test the spirits? Well, we listen to what the apostles said. We listen to what Jesus said. We listen to what the Spirit said.
One other point I want to make is when we read the Bible, there's actually two different contexts that we need to keep in mind. We need to keep in mind the literary context, but we also need to keep in mind the cultural context. And the background upon which this was written was that there were obvious other gods.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 1 Corinthians talks about
Mm-hmm.
other gods, and that's what those people were dealing with. In our culture today, we don't deal with that too much. We don't run into people that too much, that
Yeah.
say, well, there's this
Yeah.
God of another name or whatever.
Yeah.
We run into people all the time that when they refer to God, they're talking about the same God that we're
Mhm.
talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to understand the cultural difference of the cultural background against which this was written. So it was, I would hesitate to say that it was an oversimplification, but what he was emphasizing was the fact that there is the one true God. And the way that you tell that is Christ from God.
Mhm.
Is Christ is of
Mhm.
God.
Mhm.
And that was completely different than talking about a God of the Greeks or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't deal with that in our culture.
Right.
But they were
Right.
having to deal with that.
Yeah, yeah. As far as being able to identify their gods, that would have been pretty easy to do. And there were those even who were saying that Jesus Christ, he wasn't really of God, you know.
Who today worships an idol? And I-
Right.
I don't
Not so
anybody
much.
that does that more.
Not so much in Christian religions today, you know. And yet, a whole nother discussion. There are those things that become like idols to us, you know. But it's not presented in the same way. Wrap it up, Brad.
Yeah, one last, because he says, you are from God and have overcome them, and overcome the world, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then John is the one that records for us, take heart, is what Jesus says, I have overcome the world.
Mhm.
So that just kind of connects the
Does.
whole confidence in who we believe.
That's right.
Who do we follow? So I think that's interesting that, I mean, again, this goes back to who wrote this? Well, this is so mistaking it. So
Mhm.
anyways,
Yeah.
it's just a reference back to his gospel.
Right. Yeah, that's right. All right, good. Our time's gone. We only did 6 verses today, but wow, there's just so much right there. I wanted us to really have some emphasis there. God willing, on Wednesday night, we'll pick up at verse 7 and start moving on from there. Appreciate your comments. Good comments this morning. I'm glad you are here.